October 21, 1944, 2:00 in the morning, Elsenborn, Belgium. The rain hammered against the canvas tent with relentless fury, each drop like a bullet fired from the dark sky above. Inside, Second Lieutenant Frances Slanger sat hunched over a wooden crate that served as her desk, a single flickering candle casting shadows across the words she was writing. Around her, 3 other nurses slept, their breathing steady, rhythmic, the only sound of peace in a war that knew no peace. Frances couldn't sleep. Not tonight. Not after what she had seen, what she had felt, what she had witnessed in the 132 days since she waded ashore at Normandy beach just 4 days after D-Day. The fire in the tent's small stove was burning low. Just a few live coals glowing at the bottom. She fed it slowly, methodically, watching as the flames caught and grew. And as she watched, a thought struck her. How similar a fire was to a human being. If it wasn't allowed to run down too low, if there was just a spark of life left in it, it could be nursed back. So could a human being. It was slow. It was gradual. It was what she did every single day in this field hospital 3 miles from the German border. She returned to her letter, her pen scratching across the paper in the candlelight. She was writing to Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, not to seek recognition for herself but to honor the men she treated. The wounded soldiers who never cried, who always asked about their buddies first, who displayed courage and fortitude that was sometimes awesome to behold. We wade ankle deep in mud. She wrote, "You have to lie in it." What Frances Slanger didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that she had less than 5 hours to live. The letter she was writing would be published after her death. That soldiers across Europe would read her words and weep. She would become the first American nurse killed by enemy action in the European theater. Her death a symbol of a sacrifice most people would never fully understand. This is the story of the nurses who went to war. Not the sanitized version, not the Hollywood fiction. The real story of women who waded through blood and mud, who held dying boys in their arms, who worked 36-hour shifts without rest, who were bombed, shelled, captured, starved, and killed. Women who saved hundreds of thousands of lives while the world barely noticed. Their story begins long before France. Long before the beaches of Normandy were stained red. It begins in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. In moments of terror that would define what it meant to be brave. December 7th, 1941. For the American nurses stationed in the Philippine Islands, life had been something close to paradise. Manila was a tropical wonderland of warm beaches, elegant social clubs, and the kind of adventure young American women could rarely find back home. The nurses lived in comfortable quarters, tended dances with handsome officers, played golf on pristine courses, and enjoyed the exotic beauty of the islands. First Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt, a veteran nurse, on her second tour in the Philippines had seen dozens of young nurses arrive filled with excitement, ready for the romance and adventure that military service in the Pacific promised. Teaching positions and secretarial work held little appeal for these women. Nursing offered them a career, independence, and a chance to see the world. On December 8, 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, paradise shattered into 1,000 pieces. Japanese warplanes screamed over Manila, their bombs turning hospitals into infernos, machine guns cutting down anyone caught in the open. In a single morning, everything changed. The nurses who had come seeking adventure now found themselves thrust into the first American combat zone of World War II, facing dangers for which they had received no training, carrying no weapons, wearing helmets that felt impossibly heavy. At Sternberg General Hospital in Manila, The casualties began flooding in immediately. Wounded soldiers, blood-soaked and screaming, arrived faster than the small medical staff could handle. Nurses, who had been treating routine ailments, now faced traumatic amputations, chest wounds, abdominal injuries. The horrific reality of modern warfare delivered in an endless stream of broken bodies. Second Lieutenant Frances Nash was among those who received the order to evacuate to the Bataan Peninsula as Japanese forces closed in on Manila. Before she left, a superior officer handed her a small package containing morphine, enough to give each army nurse a lethal dose. Nash and every other nurse understood the implications, had heard the stories about Japanese treatment of prisoners. The morphine was their last resort, their final escape if capture meant something worse than death. She tucked the morphine into her hair, where it would stay hidden until February 1945. The nurses fleeing Manila thought they were simply relocating to another military hospital. They were wrong. Became the first large group of American women sent directly into a combat zone, working in field hospitals that consisted of nothing more than makeshift sheds with thatched roofs, open to the elements, within range of enemy artillery. General Hospital No. 1 near Lime received casualties directly from the front lines. Within the first month, more than 200 battle casualties, requiring major surgery, poured through its doors. Head wounds, chest wounds, abdominal wounds, traumatic amputations. The nurses' starched white uniforms, symbols of their profession's dignity and standards, were quickly replaced by size 44 mechanics, overalls, and later by homemade khaki skirts and blouses. As one surgeon observed, rivulets of sweat washed away their rouge and powder, leaving only lipstick to match the ruby red blood that covered their hands and arms. They worked 12-hour shifts that stretched into 16, 20, then days without sleep. The bombs fell constantly. Japanese artillery shells screamed overhead. Malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever swept through both patients and staff. Supplies dwindled to almost nothing. Food rations were cut in half, then cut again. But they kept working. Lieutenant Juanita Redmond described treating casualties during the constant bombardment. We worked with the sound of shells exploding around us, the building shaking, plaster falling from the ceiling. We couldn't evacuate the patients who couldn't move, so we stayed with them. We held their hands. We whispered that everything would be all right, even though we knew it wasn't. Even though we were terrified ourselves. By April 1942, anyone with eyes could see that the end was near. General Douglas MacArthur had already been ordered to leave for Australia. No relief convoy was coming. The Philippines were lost. On April 8, Josie Nesbitt received the evacuation order, but only for American nurses. The Filipino nurses, who had worked just as hard, bled just as much, were ordered to stay behind. Nesbitt, who had been described by her colleagues as a force of nature in nurses' clothing, dug in her heels. "If my Filipino nurses don't go, I'm not going either," she declared. Her superiors relented. All the nurses were evacuated to Corregidor, but they had to leave their patients behind. Wounded men, some of whom they had treated for months, men they had laughed with and consoled, and promised would see home again. Lieutenant Maud Denny Williams had to leave her own sick husband in the hospital. The nurses protested, begged, demanded to stay. They were given direct orders to evacuate. They obeyed. The next morning, Bataan surrendered. They left behind faced the Bataan Death March, a 65-mile forced march through tropical heat, during which 600 to 1,000 Americans and thousands of Filipinos died from exhaustion, disease, execution, and random acts of cruelty. The nurses on Corregidor could hear the sounds of the massacre from across the water. Corregidor was no refuge. The fortress island, the Rock, was under constant siege. The nurses lived and worked in the damp, claustrophobic tunnels of Malinta, where the air was thick and stale, where the thunder of artillery was constant, where the walls shook with every near miss. The hospital ward was set up in a lateral tunnel carved out of solid rock, 800 feet long, 20 feet wide, with wounded men packed in rows on cots and stretchers, and when those ran out, directly on the stone floor. The smell was overwhelming: blood, sweat, gangrene, disinfectant, fear. Nurses moved through the dim light cast by a few hanging bulbs, checking IVs, changing bandages, administering morphine, whispering encouragement to boys who were dying thousands of miles from home. On April 29, 1942, a small group of Army nurses were evacuated aboard a Navy PBY Catalina flying boat, but the plane was forced down on Mindanao, and the nurses ended up as prisoners anyway. Eventually transferred to Manila and interned at the University of Santo Tomas. On May 3, a few more nurses escaped aboard the submarine USS Spearfish. They were the lucky ones. On May 6, 1942, Corregidor fell. Remaining 66 Army nurses and 11 Navy nurses were captured, the largest group of American women ever taken prisoner by an enemy force. They were transferred to Santo Tomas internment camp, where they would spend the next 3 years as prisoners of war. Santo Tomas University in Manila, converted into a civilian internment camp, became home to approximately 6,000 Allied prisoners. Men, children, military personnel, missionaries, businessmen, teachers. Into this overcrowded, undersupplied prison city came 77 American military nurses who would earn the name Angels of Bataan and Corregidor. Major Maud Davison, the chief nurse, immediately established a structure that would save lives, including their own. The nurses would maintain their military identity, their professional standards, their purpose, would work as a nursing unit, staffing the makeshift Santa Catalina Hospital within the camp. They would care for the thousands of sick and dying prisoners with the same dedication they had shown on Bataan and Corregidor. It was a decision that meant the difference between survival and surrender to despair. The Navy nurses, captured in Manila, had already demonstrated the kind of resourcefulness that would define the American nursing corps throughout the war. When the Japanese ordered supervisory nurse Laura Cobb to catalog medical supplies before looting them, she and her colleagues deliberately mislabeled valuable medicines. Quinine became bicarbonate of soda. The Japanese, looking for specific drugs, overlooked what they believed was worthless. Life in Santo Tomas was a slow descent into starvation. Rations were cut repeatedly. By 1945, prisoners were receiving only 1 cup of rice twice a day. The nurses, like everyone else, grew gaunt, clothes hanging loose on frames that had lost 30 to 40% of their body weight. Major Davison dropped from 135 pounds to 80 pounds, but they never stopped working. Colonel Ruby Bradley, who had been captured at Camp John Hay in northern Luzon, became one of the camp's most dedicated caregivers. Despite being a prisoner herself, despite the constant hunger and disease, she found ways to help. She would shove food into her pockets whenever she could, scraps, anything, to feed starving children in the camp, often going hungry herself to make sure others ate. Ruby Bradley performed emergency surgery in the primitive camp hospital. She assisted in delivering babies. She treated prisoners dying of malnutrition, beriberi, dysentery, the slow wasting diseases of starvation. She did all of this while suffering from the same conditions herself, while watching fellow prisoners die one by one, while wondering if rescue would ever come. The nurses discovered that their patients needed more than medical care. They needed hope. They needed to believe they were still human beings, not just numbers waiting to die. So the nurses sang to them. They told stories. They held their hands. They brought a touch of humanity to a place designed to strip it away. Josephine, Mama Josie, Nesbit, who had saved her Filipino nurses from abandonment on Bataan, now worked to keep all her nurses alive. She took over shifts when nurses became too sick to work, which happened frequently. She scrounged for extra food. She enforced rest periods when her nurses tried to work themselves to death. She was a mother figure in hell, fierce and protective and utterly unwilling to lose a single one of her girls. And somehow, miraculously, she didn't. Of the 77 nurses captured, all 77 survived. It was unprecedented, particularly for women who had received no formal survival training, who had no military combat experience beyond what they had learned in the crucible of war itself. But survival came at a terrible cost. These women watched hundreds of their patients die. They performed medical procedures with no equipment, no medicine, no anesthesia, lived in constant fear that the Japanese would decide to make an example of them. They endured the psychological torture of not knowing if America even remembered they existed, rescue would ever come, if they would die in this camp and be forgotten. On February 3, 1945, American forces finally liberated Santo Tomas. Cavalry divisions, flying column, burst through the gates, and the prisoners who could walk rushed forward, weeping, laughing, unable to believe it was real. The nurses, so thin their uniforms no longer fit, were taken immediately to field hospitals. Many had to be hospitalized for weeks before they were strong enough to travel home, return to America as heroes. Women who had endured 3 years of captivity without losing a single member of their unit, without giving up, without breaking, had proven something many military leaders had doubted: that women could survive and function under the most extreme conditions imaginable. But most Americans would never know their names. The war was still raging, and there were new battles to fight, new casualties to treat, new stories that would overshadow the angels of Bataan and Corregidor. June 10, 1944, 4 days after D-Day, Second Lieutenant Frances Slanger jumped from a landing craft onto a beach in France, cold water soaking her boots, the sound of artillery fire rolling across the sand like thunder. Around her, 17 other army nurses from the 45th Field Hospital waded ashore, struggling with their packs, their helmets, their fear. This was not what anyone back home imagined when they thought about military nurses. There were no pristine hospital halls, no clean white uniforms, no gentle ministering to patients in comfortable beds. There were bodies rolling in the surf, truckloads of wounded soldiers arriving from the front lines, blood-soaked bandages, men screaming, the constant threat of artillery fire, and mud, always mud. The nurses of the 42nd and 45th Field Hospitals and the 91st and 128th Evacuation Hospitals were among the first to land at Normandy after the initial invasion. They arrived to find a nightmare. First Lieutenant Ruth M. Haddock Dorsman, who had petitioned repeatedly for transfer to a field hospital so she could be closer to the action, landed on Omaha Beach on June 12. Her unit, 51st Field Hospital, was immediately besieged with casualties. She later recalled, "All the nurses just jumped right in and did whatever needed to be done, all urgent stuff like give IVs, administer oxygen, pass stomach tubes and set up suctions, possibly change bandages, and give shots." Each nurse had 30 or more seriously wounded patients to attend to at any given time, worked non-stop, often for 18 hours straight, sometimes longer. When they did try to rest, they couldn't sleep. The images of mangled bodies, the sounds of screaming, the knowledge that men were dying kept them awake. And even when exhaustion finally claimed them, they slept in their steel helmets because the shelling never completely stopped. Marion Jones, who had been inspired to join the Army Nurse Corps by President Roosevelt's date of infamy speech, spent her first night in France sleeping in a foxhole on the beach. The next day, she reported to an established evacuation hospital to relieve nurses who had been working around the clock since the invasion began. The nurse she was replacing simply pointed down the line of wounded men. "That one needs plasma. That one needs plasma. That one needs plasma." Jones, who had never administered plasma in her life, "My goodness, I've never done that." The exhausted nurse responded, "You will now," and walked away, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. Welcome to war. The field hospitals operated in tents, set up in open fields, muddy pastures, anywhere they could find space close to the fighting. German artillery could hit them at any time. Enemy aircraft flew overhead regularly. The Geneva Convention required that hospitals be marked with large red crosses and not be deliberately targeted. The Germans sometimes honored this. Sometimes they didn't. The nurses quickly adapted to the danger, learned the Anzio shuffle that their colleagues in Italy had developed, a low duck walk that kept them below the shrapnel flying through the air, learned to recognize the sound of different artillery shells, to know which ones were coming close and which ones would pass overhead, learned to dive into muddy slit trenches at the first sign of an air raid, even if it meant kneeling in water up to their waists. Lieutenant Grace Patterson, who landed on Utah Beach after D-Day, later reflected on the absurdity of people who argued about whether women should be in combat. "I think how silly they are, because we already were." The nurses of Normandy weren't just close to combat. They were in it. They treated men who had just been pulled off the battlefield, had the mud of the hedgerows on their uniforms, whose wounds were so fresh, they were still bleeding heavily. These weren't the stable, post-surgical patients nurses typically cared for in rear hospitals. These were trauma cases, catastrophic injuries, men hovering between life and death, men who needed immediate, skilled intervention or they would die. And the nurses provided it, despite having minimal training in battlefield medicine, despite the constant danger, despite the psychological toll of watching boys die in their arms, despite everything that told them they couldn't handle it. They did. Mortality rate at these field hospitals was generally under 10%. Astonishingly low, given the severity of the injuries and the primitive conditions. This was due almost entirely to the skill and dedication of the nurses, who refused to give up on their patients, who improvised solutions when supplies ran short, who worked through their own trauma and exhaustion to provide care that saved thousands of lives. First, Lieutenant Lilma Jett, serving with the 56th General Hospital, demonstrated the kind of dedication that defined these women. Her commitment to her patients took her from England to the beaches of France and beyond, always moving forward, always following the advancing Allied forces, always closer to the danger, because that's where the wounded were. Frances Slanger, the daughter of Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Poland, understood what was at stake in this war. She knew what the Nazis were doing to Jews in concentration camps. She had relatives in Lodz who had been shipped to Auschwitz and Chelmno. This wasn't abstract for her. This was personal. Every soldier she saved was a blow against the evil that had consumed her homeland. She became known for her ability to improvise under pressure and her extraordinary compassion. When a patient had trouble lifting his head to drink, she fashioned a water bottle from an IV bottle and rubber tubing. When a soldier wanted to keep the bullet or shrapnel that had wounded him as a souvenir, she found it for him. When a young man cried out for his mother, she sang to him, held his hand, gave him the comfort he needed. Her fellow nurses noticed something else about Frances. She seemed to understand that soldiers needed more than physical healing. They needed their humanity restored. They needed to be reminded that they were more than just numbers in a vast military machine, that someone cared about them as individuals, that they mattered. In October 1944, 45th Field Hospital moved to Belgium, setting up just 3 miles from the German border. The sound of artillery was constant. The hospital was hit by shrapnel regularly. The nurses continued working. On the night of October 2021, Frances Slanger couldn't sleep. She had been awake for an hour, listening to the rain hammer against the tent, thinking about the discussions she and the other nurses had been having during the day. They had been reading letters to Stars and Stripes, in which soldiers praised the work of nurses, thanking them for their care and compassion. Frances felt those letters had it backwards. It was the soldiers who deserved the praise, not the nurses. So she began writing her own letter, by candlelight, in the early hours of the morning. It is 200, and I have been lying awake for 1 hour, listening to the steady breathing of the other 3 nurses in the tent. She wrote about how much the nurses had learned about American soldiers, about their courage and fortitude, about how the wounded never cried, about how they always asked about their buddies first. She wrote, "We have learned a great deal about our American boy and the stuff he is made of. The wounded do not cry, buddies come first." She finished the letter as dawn approached, and placed it with the outgoing mail that morning. That evening, at approximately 700 p.m., German artillery began shelling the field hospital. This was unusual. It was the first time in the European theater that a clearly marked field hospital had been deliberately targeted. Shells came without warning. One shell scored a direct hit on the nurse's tent. Second Lieutenant Frances Slanger was struck by shrapnel in the chest. Second Lieutenants Elizabeth Powers, Christine Cox, and Margaret Bowler were also wounded. Medical staff rushed to provide aid, but Frances's injuries were catastrophic. Even as she lay dying, witnesses reported, she was more concerned about the other wounded nurses and soldiers than herself. Her last thoughts were for the people she had dedicated her life to saving. Frances Slanger died at age 31, becoming the first and only American nurse to be killed by direct enemy action in the European theater. 2 other nurses, Second Lt. Elizabeth Powers and Second Lt. Margaret Bowler, were also killed in the attack. The editors at Stars and Stripes, not knowing Frances was dead, published her letter as a guest editorial. It appeared in newspapers across Europe, reaching hundreds of thousands of American servicemen. The response was overwhelming. Soldiers wrote letters to Frances Slanger, thanking her for reminding them of their humanity, telling her she had renewed their hope in the midst of horror. A week later, when Stars and Stripes reported that Lieutenant Slanger had been killed, the letters turned into demands. Soldiers insisted that her memory be kept alive somehow, that her sacrifice be recognized, that she not be forgotten. An army hospital ship was commissioned in her honor, the USAH Frances Y. Slanger. A Jewish war veterans post was named after her, the first such post to be named for a woman. And her letter, written in those quiet hours before dawn, continued to circulate, continued to inspire, continued to remind people of what nursing under fire really meant. But Frances Slanger was far from the only nurse to die in this war. She was just one of the few whose story was told. January 23, 1944, one day after the Allied landing at Anzio, Italy, The 33rd Field Hospital, the 95th Evacuation Hospital, and the 96th Evacuation Hospital landed on the beaches with the assault forces, quickly setting up operations in what should have been a triumphant advance behind German lines. Surprise attack had been nearly perfect. Casualties in the initial landing were less than 1% instead of the projected 12%. But then the Allies hesitated. Instead of pushing inland immediately, they consolidated the beachhead. The Germans, brilliant tacticians despite their evil cause, used that hesitation to reinforce their positions. Within days, entire Allied force found itself trapped in a narrow beachhead, completely surrounded, under constant observation from German positions in the surrounding hills. The medical facilities were set up in an area that would become known as Hell's Half Acre. Flat, open ground with absolutely no cover, within range of German artillery, under the flight path of Luftwaffe bombers. Approximately 200 nurses were assigned to these hospitals. They were about to face 4 months of unrelenting hell. On January 24, 2 days after landing, the first bombs fell near the medical facilities. That night, 3 British hospital ships, HMS St. David, HMS St. Andrew, and HMS Leinster, were attacked by Luftwaffe aircraft while evacuating casualties. The ships were well lighted and clearly marked with red crosses. The Germans bombed them anyway. The St. David took a direct hit and sank. Among the 226 medical staff and patients aboard, 2 Army nurses were among the 130 survivors pulled from the water by the damaged Leinster. One of those nurses, Second Lieutenant Ruth Hindman, had previously survived the bombing of another hospital ship, the Newfoundland. She had now survived 2 separate attempts by the enemy to sink clearly marked medical vessels. Welcome to Anzio, where the rules of war didn't seem to apply. The shelling of the hospital areas was constant. Nurses and patients alike learned to recognize the peculiar whistle of German artillery shells. Was one particular gun the men called the Anzio Express, a long-range railway gun that fired shells so massive they shook the ground when they exploded, even when they landed hundreds of yards away. The hospitals operated in tents marked with huge red crosses on white circles, clearly visible from the air and from German observation posts in the hills. Geneva Convention was supposed to protect these facilities. Sometimes it did, often it didn't. On February 7, 1944, a German fighter plane, fleeing from pursuing Allied aircraft, jettisoned its bombs while flying over the 95th Evacuation Hospital. Whether this was deliberate or accidental would be debated for years. What wasn't debatable was the result. Wrecked hit on the surgical section killed 26 staff members and patients, including 3 nurses. Another 64 were wounded. 3 days later, on February 10, German shells fell directly into the crowded tents of the 33rd Field Hospital, killing 1 nurse and wounding several other personnel. The day before this attack, several news correspondents had discussed among themselves whether the constant shelling made it safe for nurses to remain on the beachhead. The shells answered that question definitively. To provide some protection against shrapnel, engineers dug shallow rectangular pits, as far down as the high water table would allow. The hospital tents were erected in these pits. Walls of sandbags were built around them to create revetments and blast shields. This helped reduce casualties, except when bombs scored direct hits, or when German anti-personnel, butterfly bombs, exploded above the tents, raining shrapnel down on everyone inside. Nurses refused to evacuate. When the 5th Army Command suggested removing them from the beachhead for their own safety, the women made it clear they would not abandon their patients. Army relented. The nurses stayed. They learned to dive into slit trenches, at the sound of incoming artillery, even though the trenches were often half full of water. Learned to work during air raids, continuing to change bandages and administer medication while bombs exploded around them. They learned to sleep in their helmets, to eat while crouching low, with the constant knowledge that the next shell might have their name on it. First Lieutenant Mary L. Roberts, Second Lieutenant Elaine A. Rowe, and Second Lieutenant Rita V. Rourke demonstrated the kind of courage that earned them Silver Stars, the first women to receive this decoration for combat action. When shells hit the 56th Evacuation Hospital, these 3 nurses remained at their posts, shielding patients with their own bodies, continuing to provide care even as shrapnel tore through the tent walls. Mary Roberts Wilson, as she would be known after the war, supervised a nursing staff of 50 in the 56th Evacuation Hospital. When German artillery targeted her facility, she kept the hospital functioning, maintaining order, ensuring that her nurses continued to provide care despite the danger. Her actions would later be featured in Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, bringing some measure of recognition to a woman who had exemplified grace under fire. Lieutenant Elma Irene Confer, Muncie, Pennsylvania, kept a journal of her experiences at Anzio. Her entries capture the relentless nature of the danger. February 15, 1944. Night duty, air raids every 2 hours. 5 o'clock raid lasted nearly an hour. Anzio, a half-mile from the hospital, was bombed. February 21, heavy air raid. German planes apparently used the hospital to locate the ammunition dump and make a direct hit to it. Long-lasting gunfire and air activity. March 22, 4 a.m. Nazis shelled the hospital at the Anzio beachhead. 5 soldiers killed, 11 wounded, estimated 15 tents heavily shelled. Perpetual air raids. Heavy gunfire. In one publication, about the medical service at Anzio, someone wrote that during February and March, the removal of nurses from the beachhead was seriously considered. Was a problem there were nowhere near enough male medical personnel to replace them. The nurses were desperately needed. Without them, the hospitals couldn't function. Without the hospitals, so the nurses stayed, and they paid the price. Between January and June 1944, the Anzio field and evacuation hospitals admitted 809 battle casualties, 245 accidental injuries, 74 medical casualties from disease. These facilities stabilized and evacuated wounded soldiers rapidly and efficiently, maintaining a mortality rate far lower than the severity of injuries and the dangerous conditions would suggest. Casualties among medical department personnel at Anzio were devastating. 92 killed, 6 nurses, 387 wounded, 19 captured, and 60 missing in action. A total of 558 medical personnel became casualties while trying to save others. Performance of army nurses at Anzio reinforced a truth that many military leaders had doubted: women could function effectively under fire on the front lines. They could work through danger, maintain their composure under bombardment, and continue providing skilled medical care, even when their own lives were in immediate jeopardy. But this knowledge came at a terrible cost. 6 nurses died at Anzio. Hundreds more were physically or psychologically wounded, all of them. Every single woman who served in that hell carried the scars of those 4 months for the rest of their lives. First Lieutenant Edna Nina Goldberg Statman had never been afraid of heights, but she had never imagined caring for critically wounded men in an airplane at 10,000 feet, where every air pocket could send you dropping hundreds of feet in seconds, where the lack of pressurization could kill patients with chest wounds, where the smell of vomit and blood filled the small cabin until you thought you would suffocate. But that was her job. Flight nurse, one of the first women trained to provide medical care aboard medical evacuation aircraft, flying wounded soldiers from combat zones to rear area hospitals. The daughter of Jewish immigrants from Russia, Edna had grown up in Detroit, Michigan. When war came, she responded to the call for volunteers to the flight nurse program and received specialized training in a new concept, bringing professional medical care to the evacuation process itself, not just at the beginning and end of the journey. Flight nurses were trained in crash procedures, field survival in ocean, jungle, desert, and Arctic environments, the critical effects of altitude on various types of patients. A man with a sucking chest wound, where air was entering the pleural cavity, could die if the plane flew too high. A soldier in shock could deteriorate rapidly at altitude. Head injuries could be catastrophically affected by pressure changes. And the flight nurses had to manage all of this in the cramped, cold, unpressurized cargo hold of a C-47 transport aircraft, with up to 16 wounded men stacked 3 high on litter racks, while flying over enemy territory, often without fighter escort. Landed with the 817th Medical Air Evacuation Squadron on Omaha Beach in late June 1944, less than 3 weeks after D-Day. The beach was still a nightmare of destroyed equipment, debris, the lingering smell of death. Her squadron set up operations and began flying continuous evacuation missions. Typical mission would begin with the C-47 loading urgently needed supplies, ammunition, medical equipment, food, and flying into a forward airfield as close to the combat zone as deemed safe. Would land, supplies would be quickly unloaded, and wounded soldiers would be loaded aboard in a matter of minutes. The longer the aircraft remained on the ground, the more vulnerable it was to enemy artillery or air attack. Then, the C-47 would take off, usually with a flight nurse and a medical technician as the only medical personnel aboard, begin the flight back to England. The journey took hours during which men could hemorrhage, go into shock, die from complications. Edna recalled, "At times during a flight, we would hit an air pocket and drop several hundred feet in the air like falling in an elevator. It took a little while for our stomachs to catch up with us." While she fought her own nausea, she had to check on the 16 patients, adjust IVs, monitor vital signs, provide morphine for pain, and offer whatever comfort she could to men who were terrified, suffering, and sometimes dying. Each plane could carry 14 litter patients stacked 3 high along both sides of the aircraft, secured by straps. The flight nurse had to be able to reach each patient, which meant climbing over and around the litters in the cramped, vibrating space. In winter, the unheated aircraft was bitterly cold. In summer, it could be stifling hot. Always was the noise, the constant roar of the engines making communication nearly impossible. And there was the psychological toll. Nurse Evelyn Cowell-Choke described in her oral history how difficult it was that patients were under her care for only a brief flight, and she never saw them again after landing. "I hated letting them go so soon after treating them," she said. The stress of these experiences plagued her, with nightmares for years after the war ended. But the concept worked. Medical air evacuation, with flight nurses providing care during transport, proved to be one of the great medical innovations of World War II. It saved countless lives by getting critically wounded men to advanced surgical facilities much faster than ground or sea transport could achieve. Geraldine "Jerry" Curtis Padone flew her first medical evacuation mission out of Normandy on June 10, 1944, just 4 days after D-Day. When conditions were finally secure enough for C-47s to land, she would fly 196 missions during the war, evacuating over 500 wounded men. She earned 6 battle stars for service in major campaigns. These were not safe missions. The C-47s were unarmed, relying on fighter escort for protection when it was available, which it often wasn't. German fighters would sometimes attack medical evacuation aircraft, despite their Red Cross markings. Anti-aircraft fire didn't discriminate, could be deadly. 13 flight nurses died in weather-related crashes during the war. First Lieutenant Alida Lutz became the first military woman to die in a combat zone in World War II, when her medical evacuation aircraft crashed. She had flown 196 missions and evacuated over 3,500 patients, earning the Air Medal 4 times, the Oak Leaf Cluster, the Red Cross Medal, and the Purple Heart. She was the first woman awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in World War II. The danger was real, constant, and accepted as part of the job. These women had volunteered for this duty knowing the risks. They flew their missions, saved their patients, and when one of them died, others grieved, and then returned to the sky because there were more wounded men who needed them. By the winter of 1944-45, many nurses were reaching their breaking point, had been serving for years, some since the beginning of the war, some through multiple campaigns. They had seen more death, more suffering, more horror than most human beings could process. Psychological concept of post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't exist for another generation. But these women were living with it, working through it, trying to maintain their sanity while surrounded by insanity. Grace Patterson, working with a field hospital in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge, described the overwhelming nature of it. Patients came by ambulance and helicopter all day and night. It was overwhelming. When I tried to rest, I couldn't sleep, thinking of all those wounded patients and all that needed to be done for them. There were some I cannot forget to this day. She recalled one soldier whose leg had been amputated, who, when told, so furious he wanted to die. There was little we could do to comfort him, she said. Another man's jaw was nearly blown off, requiring evacuation to a larger hospital that might be able to save him. Some developed kidney failure from shock and injuries, dying because there was nothing the field hospital could do for them. These were the cases that haunted the nurses, the ones they couldn't save, the ones who died despite everything they tried, the ones whose faces they would see in their dreams for decades. Viola Molloy, serving with the 50th General Hospital in Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge, described working so close to the fighting that patients had to be evacuated when the Germans advanced. The nurses were nearly evacuated themselves before the German retreat. The casualties came in so fast. Nurses had to start blood transfusions, which only doctors had done before. Whatever needed to be done was done by everyone. There was no limit. She remembered the young patients, hurt so badly, and how much worse she felt when she saw they were wearing a wedding ring. Somewhere back home, a wife was waiting for a husband who might never come back the same, if he came back at all. Lieutenant Marion Jones, working in a tent hospital in France, described the primitive conditions. One of the hard things about working in a tent hospital was that cots were so low we had to kneel by each one to keep from bending over all the time. They worked in buildings when available, but often the front moved too fast, and they found themselves back in tents, back in the mud, back in conditions that would have been considered intolerable in peacetime. The nurses adapted to circumstances most people couldn't imagine. Lieutenant Jones and another nurse were once ordered to rush aboard an evacuation plane heading to England because the flight had no medical personnel. It was her first plane ride. When they landed in England, they had no orders, no money except French francs, no idea where to go. The flight nurses at the base absolutely ignored us, she recalled. Hadn't eaten in over 24 hours, finally found a ration chocolate bar, and eventually had to hitchhike back to their unit in France. These were the unglamorous moments that never made it into the Hollywood versions of the war. The chaos, the confusion, the sense of being forgotten by everyone except the patients who desperately needed you. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, when the last shots were fired in the Pacific in August 1945, nurses finally came home. More than 59,000 women had served in the Army Nurse Corps during World War II. Another 14,000 had served in the Navy Nurse Corps. They had worked in every theater of war, in every major campaign, under every condition imaginable. The statistics told part of the story. 201 Army nurses died during the war. 16 were killed by direct enemy action. 6 died when the hospital ship USS Comfort was attacked by a Japanese suicide plane off Leyte Island in April 1945. 4 were flight nurses killed in combat operations. Other flight nurses died in weather-related crashes. The nurses received 619 medals, citations, and commendations during the war: Bronze Stars, Silver Stars, Purple Hearts, Legion of Merit. Medals: Distinguished Flying Crosses. First Lieutenant Annie G. Fox, Chief Nurse at Hickam Field during the Pearl Harbor attack, but thus Forsome was the first woman to receive the Purple Heart for her calm leadership and courage under fire, though it was later replaced with a Bronze Star due to changing regulations about the Purple Heart. Numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is in the faces of the soldiers these women saved. The boys who made it home to their families because a nurse stayed with them through the night. Who survived catastrophic injuries because a nurse refused to give up. Who found the will to live because a nurse reminded them they were still human beings worthy of love and care. Real story is in the angels of Bataan and Corregidor, all 77 of whom survived their captivity and came home against all odds because they refused to abandon their purpose even in hell. Real story is in Frances Slanger's letter, written in the hours before her death, reminding soldiers that they were the heroes, not the nurses, even though she died proving that heroism comes in many forms. The real story is in the nurses who stayed at Anzio when everyone told them to leave, who continued working while bombs fell around them, who shielded patients with their own bodies, who died saving others. The real story is in Ruby Bradley, home from Santo Tomas, weighing less than 100 pounds, but would go on to serve again in Korea, where she would be on the front lines when 100,000 Chinese soldiers overran American positions. She would retire as America's most decorated military woman, with 34 medals and citations for bravery. When the war ended, these women returned to a changed America. The place of women in American society had been irrevocably altered by the war. But for the nurses, coming home was complicated. Many of them were celebrated as heroes for a brief moment, expected to return to traditional roles, to forget what they had seen and done, to be quiet about their experiences. Many did remain quiet. They didn't talk about the war, even with their families. How could you explain what it was like to work 36 hours straight in a field hospital while men screamed and died around you? How could you make someone understand what it meant to be bombed while caring for wounded patients, to be captured and starved, to watch friends die, to carry the weight of all those you couldn't save? Cassiani Nestor, one of the angels of Bataan, said in 1999, "It's about time." There have been stories written, a person's personal story, but nobody's ever told the whole story. There's still a lot of discussion about the role of women in combat. Our group proved that we could go into the field and carry on and do a good job. People need to know that. Colonel Jane Davis, writing about the modern Army Nurse Corps, noted that the World War II nurses were the role models, the pioneers who proved that women belonged in military medicine, the way for every woman who would serve in uniform after them. In 2002, Connell Ruby Bradley died at age 94. She was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. In 1999, age 91, she had received replacements for more than a dozen military awards she had lost over the years. 34 medals and citations in total, making her the nation's most highly decorated female veteran. In 2020, legislation was introduced to award the Congressional Gold Medal, collectively, to the women who served in World War II as members of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps and U.S. Navy Nurse Corps. The bill noted, "When we look back on the extraordinary efforts by ordinary Americans during World War II, nurses deserve our recognition, gratitude, and honor. These heroes were on the front lines of the war, serving under fire to save the lives of fellow service members and allies fighting for freedom." The University of Santo Tomas, site of the internment camp that held the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, now has a plaque commemorating these women who provided care and comfort to prisoners while surviving the same deprivation and danger. At Anzio, American Cemetery at Nettuno contains the graves of thousands who'd died in that 4-month battle, including the 6 nurses who gave their lives at Hell's Half-Acre. In France, memorials to the nurses of Normandy stand near the beaches, where they landed, where they waded ashore into a war they weren't supposed to be in, where they saved thousands of lives, while the world was trying to tear itself apart. Frances Slanger is buried in the independent Pride of Boston Cemetery in Roxbury, Massachusetts, from her initial burial in a military cemetery in France. More than 1,000 people attended her reburial ceremony in 1947, including the mayor of Boston. Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter plane was painted with, in memory of LTF Slanger, USANC, and flew combat missions bearing her name. But perhaps the most important legacy is in the military medicine itself. The lessons learned by these nurses about field care, about evacuation procedures, about the psychological needs of combat casualties, about what women could accomplish under the most extreme conditions, became foundational to modern military nursing. Survival rate of wounded soldiers in World War II was unprecedented in military history. Overall, fewer than 4% of American soldiers who received medical care in the field or underwent evacuation died from wounds or disease. This was due in large part to the nurses who worked the closest to the fighting, who provided care when it mattered most, who refused to accept that a soldier's wounds were fatal until every option had been exhausted. These women proved that gender was irrelevant when lives were at stake. They proved that courage came in many forms, not just charging enemy positions with a rifle, but staying with patience while bombs fell. Tito, working through exhaustion and fear and trauma because people were depending on you, maintaining your humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it. Today, most Americans don't know the names Frances Slanger, Ruby Bradley, Maud Davison, or Josephine Nesbitt. They don't know about the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, about the nurses who died at Anzio, about the flight nurses who flew into danger to evacuate the wounded. They don't know, because these stories have been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the combat narratives of male soldiers, buried in archives, lost to a culture that didn't know how to process the idea of women in war zones. Women in danger, women sacrificing everything for their country. The soldiers these nurses saved, they remembered. The letters that poured into Stars and Stripes after Frances Slanger's death, demanding that her memory be preserved. proved that the men who were there, who received care from these remarkable women, understood the depth of their sacrifice. Every soldier who came home from World War II with a story of survival, every man who lived to see his children born, to grow old with his wife, to live a full life after the war. Many of them owed that second chance to a nurse whose name they might never have known, whose face they might have seen only once, in a moment of pain and fear, but whose skilled hands and compassionate presence made the difference between life and death. These were the women who went to war, not with rifles and grenades, but with stethoscopes and bandages, and an unshakable commitment to saving lives. They waded through mud and blood, worked under fire, endured capture and starvation, flew through dangerous skies, and died in the service of others. They were the nurses who saved hundreds under fire. We owe them more than our gratitude. We owe them our memory, our recognition, our understanding of what they sacrificed and what they achieved. On that October morning in 1944, Frances Slanger finished her letter to Stars and Stripes with these words. It's all adding up to a feeling of unrealness. Sure, we rough it, but in comparison to the way you men are taking it, we can't complain, nor do we feel that Bukites are due us. But you, the men behind the guns, the men driving our tanks, flying our planes, sailing our ships, bridges. It is to you we doff our helmets. To every GI wearing the American uniform, for you we have the greatest admiration and respect. She died hours later, never knowing that soldiers across Europe would read those words and weep, never knowing that they would write back demanding that she be remembered, insisting that the nurses who saved them deserved the same recognition, the same honor, the same remembrance. They were right. These women deserve to be remembered. They deserve to be remembered now, because in the darkest hours of humanity's darkest war, when the world was consumed by violence and hatred, when death seemed to be winning, these women chose life. They chose to save, to heal, to maintain their humanity, when every force around them was trying to destroy it. They were the nurses who saved hundreds under fire. And their story, the real story, not sanitized, not softened, not forgotten, is one of the greatest stories of courage, sacrifice, and grace that history has to offer. If this story moved you, if it made you remember the names time tried to erase, share it. Tell others. Keep their legacy alive. They gave everything for the boys they called, or soldiers. And the least we can do is make sure their sacrifice is never forgotten.